Chris Plante, welcome back to Quality Control.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We've both played an awful lot of this game, although you've played more than me. At this point, you've completed, well, I guess we should be clear, like you completed the story, which is not necessarily, hey, this is a video game, not necessarily the same thing as completing the game, right?
Yes, the game has an epilogue, and now I am in the epilogue, but I have completed the core of the game.
So yeah, it's been a long time coming. I think highly anticipated. You know, I think Rockstar, the studio that makes this game that's coming to Xbox One and PlayStation 4 and not PC yet, although if it follows the Grand Theft Auto 5 model, that will be coming maybe next year. But this is kind of Rockstar's, like, well, before this, I would argue, this is kind of Rockstar's other franchise beyond Grand Theft Auto, but I get the feeling that this is sort of a statement about how this is not the other thing we do, but like this was created with the idea that this franchise will stand toe-to-toe with Grand Theft Auto. Did you get that feeling at all?
Yeah, I am comfortable saying this as somebody from the Midwest, but it feels like this is flyover country Grand Theft Auto.
Okay.
And that, like, and there are going to be very minor spoilers. I promise not to go into the story, but I know people are going to be very sensitive. So just, if you're ultra sensitive to this, maybe wait until you've had a chance to play. But yeah, Grand Theft Auto seems very interested in the idea of, like, big city centers, right?
Yeah.
And the coasts. And, like, really sticking it to coastal elites and the American systems that, you know, power places like New York and LA, where this game, and really the Red Dead series taken as a whole, effectively covers 50% of the rest of America in terms of just ground. It covers effectively Texas, as a franchise, Texas, and the American South.
Yes.
It covers a lot of ground in this one.
That's a surprise to me, actually, that I would argue this is a Western, right? I genuinely don't believe you have to be in the West. Like, Firefly was a Western, and it took place in outer space, right?
Sure,
but this is not a game that takes place, like, in Montana.
I think
right?
I disagree with you, though.
You would be wrong, but that's okay.
We can kick off with the with the story. So just, like, to lay the groundwork, the idea is that you are a member of this larger gang. You are not the leader. You're kind of maybe like a right-hand man. And your group, which includes John Marston, the star of Red Dead 1, which this is a prequel to, is coming off of a botched job in Texas, or the game's equivalent of Texas.
Right, a mysterious botched job.
Yeah, and you are being pushed east, which means you're being pushed into the American South. And the reason I'm not sure it is a Western is it's not really about Western things. It's about what happens. It's kind of a fish out of water story of what happens when these cowboys get put in a setting that is so much bigger and more complicated than they are prepared to grapple with. They're accustomed to, I think, kind of the simplistic supposed ideals of the American West, and suddenly they are in the Gilded Age American South, and coming in contact with the politics and the bigotry and violence that is a part of that, and they just seem utterly unequipped to, one, to you know, compete with these people, but two, to even really understand American history or what's going on. A number of times, your character Arthur, he's profoundly naive, comes up against prejudice and is utterly shocked to find out that it exists.
Yeah.
So it's weird, and you have I think you have the trappings of the Western when you're not in your missions, when you're riding your horse and you're in camp and you're cooking and doing all those things. But the story itself, it really is almost about the failures of criminal organizations and cults, really. Like this, Rockstar has always been really, really interested in cults, especially like lampooning them in their silly ways with GTA 5 and GTA Online, where it's always like, oh, these are kind of like goofy and shouldn't be taken seriously despite, the real dangers of them. But I think if you take this game for what it is, it's a game about a cult, and specifically the cult of personality around this gang leader, and what happens when you buy into that.
And I think that's a good transition into Arthur as a character, too, because you called him profoundly naive. I think that's a fair read. It's not exactly how I would put it. I think Arthur's... Well, you know what? Let me even step back, right? At the beginning of the game, I had to turn on an option. I didn't have to. I turned on the option in the menus to show the speaker in subtitles because I was so... because there were many situations where, like, I didn't really know who Arthur was in those first few hours as a character, right?
Yeah.
And then people would be talking, and I'd think, wait a minute, am I saying this or is somebody else saying this? And so, like, the game begins with Arthur as, like, I'm not sure if he's a good guy or a bad guy or somewhere in between, and I'm not even sure when I'm talking. And eventually, to my actual surprise, really do believe that I know who Arthur is, even though the beginning of the game does not spend a ton of time like building up who the character is.
Yeah.
And his part of who he is goes back to that profoundly naive thing where I'm not sure that I would use that phrasing so much as I would use like a dude who is checked out. Like he has no dog in any hunt, and it does come off as maybe a little strange when he's shocked to when he appears shocked to find out that like in Reconstructionist Southern America there's racism and stuff, but it's also like a way to like I think for Rockstar to deal with what was going on at the time without like presenting you a moral choice where you have to choose which side you're on.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm mixed. I have really complicated feelings around Arthur and the decision to make him like this. I think he is just completely absent-minded and out of touch because the game kind of presents really, really serious issues like history lessons, and it's Arthur as kind of as a reporter you have to do this where you don't want to have the answers, right? You want to ask questions to get the answers.
Right.
So that sounds strange and I'll explain it a little more, but he's often having to like ask like, so plantations, people are lynched here. Like, and it's like, what? You don't know anything about this at all? You're that out of touch? But then it allows the characters to give, like a 4-minute kind of primer, as grim as that is, on the history of plantations and tenant farming and all of these other things that are. It ends up being that certain characters just have to become the mouthpiece for certain causes. Right.
And they don't, to be fair, there's no, I don't know, what's the term, like both sides-ism here? Like I don't think that any of no specific spoilers are here in most of what we talk about, right? But there are, say, active plantations that can't use slavery anymore, and they don't like Rockstar doesn't treat them as particularly sympathetic characters.
That's true, but a thing that I do find, and I honestly I'm still like grappling with like how do you do this?
That's a credit to the game, right? That there is grappling.
Yeah. So my issue is it's a lot of telling and not showing, and it's not like I want to see, awful race crimes or violence in this game. At the same time, it completely betrays history. And an example of this that I think is really clear is you come across the KKK a number of times in the game, not in any story mission so far as I can tell. It's just part of, and we can transition to this after this. You have these dynamic run-ins with people, and every single time I run in with the KKK, before I can even just obliterate them and use this as some weird violence fantasy, they, again, spoiler for 15 seconds if you care about an incidental thing, they kill themselves. Their plate is total slapstick morons. And that's not how it worked. Like, they were part of a mechanism that was ruthlessly violent and efficient in one, killing innocent black people and other people of color in the South, but also across America, but also just creating an institution where people weren't allowed places. And that is not portrayed much, as far as I can tell, at all in this game, where it doesn't really matter who you are. People just walk through every city, and they're all kind of all NPCs are treated equal. So it's this weird thing of like, how do you design for that, right? Like, I think Mafia 3 handled this in a lot of interesting ways, but I think here they create a lot of systems, but creating a world that actually reflects what was going on culturally at that time, I just don't think it's there. And I think that was a decision, right? Like, again, that's an uncomfortable thing to put into a game. But it is this weird thing where they talk about it so much that then for it not to really be reflected in the world is strange.
Point taken. Just maybe to cap it off. I think this is part of an ongoing trend in video games, right? We talked about this on something similar to this, right? On the Tomb Raider episode.
Yeah. That
me, you, and Charlie were on, right? Where games are, to varying degrees of success, attempting to wrestle with these sorts of things. It's an ongoing process. The criticism of it is an ongoing process, and I think everybody will come to their decision about how these games deal with this stuff. But it's a trend worth pointing out and talking about it for the first 13 minutes of this episode.
And the thing I do want to say that I think this game does so much better than any Rockstar game before this is at least it does take the story seriously. There's still hints of that like Rockstar irony, satire. Oh, we really gotta a grind on Americana and the history of America that just never has really clicked for me and always felt a bit, I don't know, grotesque. There's a little bit of it here when you go into theaters. I think pretty much any theater that you go to, the shows that you see are these weird bits that feel completely at odds with the rest of the game's tone. But for the most part, the main story is pretty grounded, barring some late game stuff. It tries to be grounded. It tries to take these characters seriously. It tries to take their pains and their wants seriously. And it is so refreshing to play this game where it seems like it actually cares about these people, all of them, and that it makes for such a more enjoyable experience to spend so many hours in this world. Even if it does mean that, people like Arthur are a little, unbelievably on the angelic for supposed criminals, it makes it more enjoyable.
What's interesting about Arthur to me, and I say interesting deliberately because I haven't sort of rendered my final judgment on this, but he is, Arthur, I think good at his core, but also entirely willing to do somewhat gross things.
Yeah.
Right? Like you when you have the option to choose, I always choose the good option, right? The sort of paragon thing, right? Because that's who I want to play as. I want to be a good guy. But there are missions where you straight up have to just go and beat up poor farmers who can't pay back their debts. And I thought that was, it is strange, right?
Dave,
you're trying to be a good guy and you have to do it. But then again, and this is sort of my evolution on my Arthur thinking, is it does actually work for his character because he is a guy, he is both, he's like an idealist and an outlaw. He's checked out, but he has to deal with things he can't fully check out. And it's this, you're thrown into these situations where you can choose to be good or you just have to be bad. And then occasionally he sort of steps back and ruminates on the bad things he's done.
Yeah.
And sometimes that is just presented to you in 15-second little cutscenes. Other times you only find out about Arthur and what he's thinking by taking action, by say reading his journal or making a choice to speak to somebody in camp, and in a completely optional interaction, you find out that Arthur's been feeling weird and guilty about randomly killing animals.
Yeah. I'm going to take this in a very strange direction that I would only do with you, because I think you will have some opinion on this. And first off, not calling the Catholic Church a cult is where I'm going to start this conversation.
All right.
But as a Catholic, I've been there is the bishop of my hometown, Kansas City. He got shipped to Wyoming, and there was a big report about a lot of horrible things that he's allowed. He might be the first bishop in the U.S. to actually be sentenced, which is really interesting and horrible, and something I've been thinking about a lot while playing this game. And a thing that I was thinking about with this character and how I sometimes feel as a Catholic of what happens when you deeply believe in the original ideal, right?
Yeah.
And there are good people within the group who are participating in the ideal.
Yes.
But something about the institution has gone rotten.
Yeah.
And you find yourself even just when I tithing, right? Of what does this mean? Am I contributing to, in some capacity, legal funds for these people, right? And I like I said, this is a long walk, and we're now far away from this video game. But that was something that, if I'm giving a really generous read to his naivete, was before we met this guy, he is at his core a good person, and he believes that he is effectively Robin Hood, right?
Yeah.
And that there is a good cause here.
Yeah, and there is they do this sort of, depending on your read of it, interesting or weaselly thing where in every example I can think of where you have to do something outlawish, there's always a line or two where they talk about where they basically make you think or give you the out and say we're only stealing from the bad guys. That sort of thing, right? They do that constantly where if you want an excuse to feel better about what you're about to do, you have it. It's there.
The big one for me is there are home robbery missions as optional missions. And when I saw those, I was like, yikes. That is a lot. And even with those, before each one, they give you this well, sure, it's a home, but actually it's run by, these cultists who are performing blood rituals. And it's I don't even know if this really counts as a home robbery at this point. The way you're making it sound, I feel like I'm on a superhero mission.
Yeah, and to get back to what you were saying earlier, Dutch runs the camp. People who played the original Red Dead know Dutch. This is a pre-Red Dead 1 version of Dutch. And he has that dichotomy, if that's not a ridiculous word to use here. He has that too, because at its core, on one level, he's a dude who's in charge of an outlaw gang. On the other hand, he wastes no opportunity to talk about his ideals, about freedom and the promise of America and all of these things. And neither of those things is black and white. The whole game exists in this shade of gray where I think, to your point, it does challenge you to think am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the wrong thing? Can I do the right thing in the context of doing something that may seem wrong?
Yeah.
And by the way, gameplay-wise, I think this is the best feeling Rockstar game I've ever played. I know that's a hard turn, but it feels good.
I think I agree. It still has all the weird Rockstar issues, right? It's a better version of, I wouldn't say the shooting is revelatory by any means. It still feels kind of like GTA shooting. It's still very magnetic. The hand-to-hand combat is bad. I'm honestly shocked that it shipped like this, because I don't know what it even is.
I mean, I don't want to forgive something that I also agree is not good, but I don't know that anybody solved that problem. Right?
I mean,
like, I think of the Uncharted games that tried to, like, every Uncharted game tries to reinvent hand-to-hand combat and stuff, and it's like, I don't know, it always in video games, to my mind, it always devolves into, like, locking the camera and trying to punch and block.
Yeah, I think the problem is you have to decide if you want to be cinematic or if you want to, like, give the player control, right? Like, that was the Assassin's Creed thing. Assassin's Creed had this very cinematic fighting, and it solved for it, but it got very boring. And then they switched over to the kind of Dark Souls-y action game combat, but it loses that cinematic look. And this very much it keeps it quick. It's just,
and you're not locked into those situations all the time either.
Yeah, it feels to me like there was probably more there, and then they cut their losses because I remember there being enough hype around this at a certain point where, like, oh, the combat is, it's just brawling. It's of the same quality as the shooting, which I don't know. That doesn't maybe say that much.
Right. Well, I feel like the shooting, at least for me, I don't know how you've played it, but, like, I would say 99% of the time shoot with Deadeye. Like, I don't see any reason not to use Deadeye when I shoot. Just because, well, I mean, partly because it's cool. So the Deadeye mechanic, for anybody who doesn't know, is basically you press a button and you slow down time. It's, like bullet time in the Matrix. And when time is slowed down, a meter ticks down. So you don't have unlimited time in Deadeye. And what you want to do when you do that is invoke Deadeye, basically aim the little white reticle at somebody's head, hit a button, maybe go over to somebody else's head if you think you have enough time in meter, mark their head too, and then hit the fire button, and you automatically take 2 shots at people's heads. And, like, there's something about a sort of cowboy game where I feel like I want to shoot from the hip, but I just like Deadeye so much that I use it at absolutely every opportunity.
Yeah, that makes sense. It also solves for kind of the slowness of reloads and just the goofy aiming of traditional Rockstar games.
Right.
I do want to talk about the giant system of this game, which I do think overall works, but when it doesn't work, it's infuriating. It's the uncanny open valley, I think is the phrasing that we discussed earlier for it, of the entire world, everyone you can greet or antagonize, or you can pull a weapon on.
Howdy, partner.
You can rob. And
hey there, mister.
Yep, most of the time, it's just that. It is, I would say, sub-JRPG in terms of the depth that you can get from talking to strangers. They say next to nothing. And when you try to make it your own, I think it tends to fail. The 2 big moments for me early on were, there's a man that we had captured at the camp, and he was begging for food, and there's food right next to him, and I got it, I held it, and there wasn't an option to give it to him, and when I ate it, he got upset, so it's like he could see me do that, I think, but then when I threw it on the ground in front of him, it was nothing. So you can kind of see this, like, oh, well, they planned for me to do this, but not that. Yeah. The other moment that was really disturbing for me was I just came across a public hanging, like a town square hanging, and the man's mother is, like, sobbing in the crowd watching this and begging that it not happen, right? And the crowd disperses after the body drops, except for her. And I go up to her thinking, like, oh, I can, console her. Like, there must be something to do here, or talk to her, or at least, or greet her. And no, nothing. The only option that it allowed me to have in that moment was pull my gun on her. And it's like that weird thing where it wants you to, like, really live in this world, and if you try to do that, it just doesn't. It's not ready to meet you there. Yeah. But what I found myself doing later in the game was, I will never try to make my own story. But if I see it basically, if it's call and response, like if something is calling at me, I can respond to it with this system, and it will feel pretty natural. So at that point, like, I met a man who had been attacked by wolves, And he was like, begging me for help, and I could give him whiskey or give him medicine. And I gave him medicine, and he like screamed at me because he's like, what is medicine going to do? I'm bleeding out. And then he just died.
All right.
Yeah. So like, I think it works really well as a means of responding to various situations. But even then, like the KKK stuff, like there wasn't really much of. I don't think I had any clear options to get involved with that. Not that they even had that much time before they took care of themselves.
This brings up one of, if not my absolute favorite part of the game, which is. It is something that I saw in Breath of the Wild last year and loved, but I think it is that plus, like there's more to it, which is the world is filled with these sort of emergent, every word I can think of, bespoke emergent, and then I want to throw up for using both of those words. But there are these situations, right, where you'll be riding down the road and somebody will be calling for your help. And I'm sure that it's just mathematically pulling from a series of things that might happen and then just setting them in front of your path. But practically speaking, those things come up so often and seem so natural and are often really funny.
Yeah.
That like it gives that feeling I haven't really had since Breath of the Wild, which is, you said this at the very, very beginning when we were just starting to play the game. That part of that Red Dead 2 kind of feels like a simulation game, right?
Yeah.
Like they put so much time into creating this world and writing the code that governs the systems, and the practical effect of that is that it just feels like a real world that I'm just sort of moving around in. And not all of those things work particularly well, but I would, at least in my experience, because what you run into may not be what I run into, right? So we can have fundamentally different experiences about the same fundamental thing that's happening in the game. But like, I have enjoyed all of those things so far. Like, I mean, there are things I don't even want to spoil, but like a simple one is that I just did I was testing out fast travel, which is a thing in this game in at least 3 different ways. And I wound up in a town.
None of them good.
And then I wound up in a town and realized that there was a bounty on my head. So I check the map and I go to the place where I can pay my own bounty. And I went there and I did that. And then as I'm on my way back into the town to see if there's anything to do, I run into this dope. If anybody has seen, so if you've seen Tombstone, the movie, there's Sheriff Behan,
sure,
who's like the dope of and on the side of the cowboys in Tombstone. And there are several characters in this game who I think are cut from that cloth. And I basically found a Sheriff Behan-like character who was essentially an idiot lost in the woods and couldn't find his way back to the town. And then I accepted his invitation and walked him back to town and got some, good guy points and stuff. Now, couple of things about that. First of all, I guess on one level it was absurd because it was literally one road, a straight shot. Now, on the other hand, the story was like he was afraid to walk back by himself. So essentially I was offering him protection. But I didn't mind doing that. It was I have to walk as slowly as possible on my horse for 4.5 minutes, but I didn't mind doing it because we had a conversation the whole way there, and it was actually interesting. And like, they do a lot of, like, they don't reinvent. They haven't like, what's the word I'm looking for? They haven't obsoleted sort of boring, otherwise boring, like, follow missions. What's the word I'm looking for?
Like the fetch quests.
Thank you. But they have made them interesting because they write these little scripts for them, right? And I find myself, this is a broader point about the game, which is I think you can learn a lot about how Red Dead Redemption 2 wants to be played by looking at one thing, and that is Arthur's default movement speed, whether he's on foot or on his horse, and that is slow. In other words, if you want to jog or run or gallop, you have to take deliberate action. You have to hit a button to move. And I think that speaks volumes for how the people who made this game want you to play this game, which is that you don't want to run from place, like they don't want you to run from place to place because you'll miss things in the middle.
And there's a cinematic camera mode, which is not a camera mode at all. It is a you don't need to play the game mode, and you can just watch it. So anytime you are on these missions where you're effectively just need to follow a trail, you hold down A, and then you awkwardly hold down one of the option buttons on the controller. It's the 2 square button. It makes it so that they just move on their own, or I think maybe you have to still hold down A. I do just in case. But they follow the path, so you don't have to do really anything other than hold down that button. And the camera cuts around to try to make it a little more dynamic. It doesn't look especially cinematic.
It does when it prompts you, like there are quests where like there's a 2-minute ramp up to the actual action of the quest, and sometimes it will prompt you to go to cinematic camera, which makes it more interesting. But when like your cinematic, I wouldn't recommend anybody use cinematic camera if they're just like traveling because it becomes very confusing.
I'm the opposite. Use it all the time.
Oh, really? Okay.
So here's my friend, you are about to learn the joys of cinematic camera.
All right.
Because you have not reached the final chapter.
All right.
So the fast travel in this game is bad. It is, you can travel by train, stagecoach, and you have to get to them. But there are many times in the game where they're locked, as far as I can tell, including, I believe, the end of the core game. At which point, which is a very fun time for them to be locked, because you have to travel across huge stretches of land.
Okay.
And you can also upgrade your camp to travel from your camp to a location. But that means...
But that's a one-way trip.
Yeah, too, and you have to also get to your camp, which is often not convenient.
Right, you find yourself in a situation where you fast travel for free outside of your camp, but then you can't fast travel for free back to your camp, so you may have to take a train or a stagecoach and pay for it if you want to travel back too close to your camp, which, by the way, you can't travel directly to because it's hidden.
So what I was doing at a certain point, especially in the end, was like, okay, I've got a 10-minute ride ahead. I think maybe it was faster, but it certainly didn't feel like it. I'm just going to switch on like cinematic mode, and if I hear anybody yelling from the side, I can pull over and do whatever side stuff there is.
Wait, so when you switch to cinematic mode and you're just riding somewhere, can you let go of the controls?
I hold down A. I hold down like the A on the controller, and I don't have to look at anything.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't know that because that's why I was saying I wouldn't recommend cinematic, but if you just need to hold down the button as if that's actually another, I think, good innovation in this game is that whenever you're like on your horse and riding to a mission with somebody else, if you just hold down A or it's X on PlayStation 4, you keep pace with the people around you, which is a solution for the video game thing where like you're going somewhere and you're always walking faster and slower than the other person. It just matches the speed.
I think this was in GTA 5 and maybe in Red Dead 1. I think.
Okay.
I think for like walking in GTA 5. I could be wrong, but I think this is like a thing that they've honed. I know we're like running late, so I want to hit the core missions of the game, and I think that'll take us back to whether or not this is a Western.
Go for it.
And so the core missions of the game there are a ton of heists. Basically, until the end, at which point it becomes an action game and suffers deeply. But so much of the game is really strong heist missions that have the feel of the best parts of Grand Theft Auto heist, and I would say the best missions of Red Dead 1.
Okay.
They are group-based because you have this gang. And just a real quick aside, because I'm trying to burn through now, you hang out with your gang at a camp throughout this whole time. Talk to them as much as possible.
Yes.
Go slow, talk to them. The story works 1,000 times better if you make time to get to know these people.
I was genuinely surprised at how much I started caring for these people. I mean, that's the idea, right? Like, there are people in your camp. There are sometimes people who join your camp, and eventually you get to know who they are and invest at least a little emotion in them.
And it rewards you.
Yep.
Those investments are definitely paid off. So you will often go on these missions that are large-scale heists, whether it's banks or trains or other things that I won't spoil.
Yep. By the way, it takes a long time in this game to learn all of the things you could do. I mean, dozens upon dozens of hours, which is why, like, in part why you said you don't want to spoil it, because like 30 plus hours into the game, I'm still learning new options for things to do.
Yeah. And I mean, these are not even like the optional stuff, which, like you said, there's just a trillion things you can do. But these are the core missions. So you do these heists, and it has a very Heat feel, which the Housers have been trying to, I think, like recreate in video games their entire careers. But because you can only carry so many weapons on your person, you have to unload them off your horse. It'll have this experience where it's like, oh, well, before I go into this mission, I know it's going to be a close quarters train robbery, so I'm going to put 2 different shotguns. I'm going to put like a automatic and or a pump action and a double barrel, and I'm going to load up on, like heavy pistols. And you see your character putting those things on their person. And then it's like you and 3 other people dressed for the thing, and you manually put on your mask. And it just has this feel. And the way the camera just kind of like lugs behind you at close range.
Yeah.
It just feels great. And I'm impressed how many... I think there's 10 hours at least of this game that could be cut away, especially from the end of the game.
Heist-wise, you mean?
Well, just from the main campaign.
Okay.
But I think the heists themselves are great. When the game gets away from the heist, or when the heists become just not really heists, they become these unwieldy action set pieces, that's when I think the game tends to struggle.
That's the back... At the
end
of
boy,
the game, right?
Yeah.
No spoilers, but
I would say the last 15 hours or so gets very action heavy, and it just did not click or resonate with me. That said, there are some moments at the end of the game that are fantastic, so it's still worth finishing. And then there is this whole epilogue, which who knows what that is. I'm just digging into that. But when the first, I don't know, 30 hours, I guess the mid, like after the first 10 hours of just learning the game, and then the next 20 to 30 hours of story missions are just really tight, I think. And it really felt like, they worked to learn what worked and what people liked about the other games, and focused their resources on just back to back. And that reminds me of the big thing of why I think it's not really a Western. You are terrible at it. That's why it's good. Your gang stinks at everything. They're utterly out of their depth in terms of what they're going up against, and that makes for really compelling action. Yeah. It reminds me of Jackie Chan does a lot with this, right? Where it's like every scene has something goes wrong and you have a prop, right? Like there's the gimmick and there's the failure, and like that creates a kind of natural narrative. It also reminded me of The Way of the Gun, a modern Western starring Ryan Philippe and Benicio del Toro. And the guy who wrote that has written the modern Mission Impossible movies, which I think also do this, which is Ethan Hunt he fails constantly through modern Mission Impossibles. Like things always go wrong, because that makes for more exciting and more relatable action. Mm-hmm. And I think this game is very, very on that wavelength of, it's so much more interesting when things go wrong and your group has to find a way to deal with it, versus, these are just the world's best heisters and they'll get through.
Yeah, they're kind of dopes.
Yeah.
It's I mean this in a good way, although it's going to sound maybe not like that. It's a weird game. And I struggled with that at first. But then when I understood, when I just sort of let go and let the game, I really, really enjoyed it. I'm still playing it. I haven't beat it beat it in the main story sense, beat it. But it is slow. It is sort of wildly open-ended. It is even like contemplative, if that doesn't sound completely idiotic. Like,
yeah,
they built this pretty like this gorgeous world that like I would say kind of fails when the camera pulls in close to be it's not quite gorgeous in like character models, but when the camera is like 10 feet away from anything, there are things that are more beautiful in this game than any game I've ever seen. And when I just married that with the idea that I'm just sort of in this world, like you said, it's kind of a simulation. I'm in charge, just sort of doing what I think Arthur would do or what I decide needs to be done. It, like I said, weird because I haven't played games like that or haven't played many games like that, but I just soaked it in eventually.
Yeah.
That's why it makes, even though I haven't been there, it makes sense to me that your criticism of like the last 15 hours of the game or whatever, when it turns into an action game, I could see how that would sort of sour the experience to some extent because it's not an action game at its core, right?
No.
Most of it is sort of going slowly, doing things at your own pace, deciding when to do things. Nobody's ushering you to do something immediately. There are very few ticking clocks. And I just enjoy being in that world.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. I mean, I look at this game as I think it will upset a million people in a million different ways. Like, I think there's so many individual things about the game that people will not like parts of it, in each for their own reason. At the same time, there's like a million parts of it that I find just astonishing.
Genuinely astonishing.
Yeah. And then at the same time, I think of like, obviously there's the conversation around, like the work that goes into making one of these games, and the human cost of this, which is real. And then that is also like factors into how I grapple with this game, right? Like, what does it mean for people to make this hyper-realistic recreation of some pseudo-idealized version of a really twisted part of American history, and at the cost of, like, parts of their personal lives for some of those people. There's just a lot going on. It is a game that I personally recommend because I think it does so much, and it pushes against the boundaries of what these open world games can be so hard that even when it fails, it's interesting, and I think there's going to be a valuable conversation around it. At the same time, it is a game that if people told me I just can't bring myself to play it, I would completely understand because it is everything from how it was made to its depiction of America to just its scope, right? Like, there are a number of people I was talking to a friend from college last night about this and Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and he was like, I'm just playing Spider-Man. Like, I know it's not, in terms of like what you actually do in the game, the most ambitious game, but I can like pop in for 15 minutes
for sure
and get a kick. Where he was like, I look at trying to play the new Assassin's Creed Odyssey and I hear that you don't get to the credit sequence until 10 hours in. And he's like, I think that's when I'll finish Spider-Man.
Right.
In this game, it makes Assassin's Creed Odyssey seem simple by comparison. Right. I mean, it is truly an investment on the scale of the biggest RPGs. It
is often astounding.
Yeah.
Like, as Ian, I can't believe what I'm looking at a lot of the time. I have dozens upon dozens upon dozens of screenshots that I just took because I want to remember how pretty it is.
Yeah.
Things like that. Like, you can see the effort.
Yeah.
You can see the long hours.
You really can. When the thing for me of just absurd detail is I was just on a ride into the middle of nowhere, and I was just like scanning the horizon for all the different animals, and I saw like there's rabbits everywhere and they're like bouncing around, and there was a deer in the distance, and without even realizing it, I'm like coming across a bend, and I look up, and like feet from my face is this perfect Galliant fox. standing there posed with his head into the wind. And like, I look at him, and the second I look at him, it's like he notices me looking, it felt like, and he scatters off. And it is this weird thing of like, there is so much going on in this world that I miss this thing that was inches from my character's face. And just like, how did they know? How did this fox in this position where the light was hitting it just so, it looked so perfectly composed and framed and thought out, and it's just this thing that was, algorithmically designed to happen.
Sure, right. It's a bunch of ones and zeros, but it feels so real.
Yeah, it feels like it has that breath of life. So yeah, that's my feelings about the game. How about you? Do you have any final thoughts?
I'm still playing. I'm still thinking about it. In part, ask me again in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, when I've settled on it. But I can tell you right now, in the middle of the game, what I said earlier, which is I genuinely love just being in it. It gives my brain stuff to chew on. There's plenty to think about inside and outside of the game, and I think if I can try to get in the minds of the developers, like reverse engineer what they were going for, they did what you said. So I'll say it for the third time. They created this simulation, and I love the simulation. In the same way that I felt, again, about Breath of the Wild or earlier this year, God of War.
Yeah.
Right? Where it just feels like a world I want to live in and explore. And that's still pretty rare in video games. I don't run into that much, and I'm enjoying this thing that's happening for the first time. This thing that I will think back on fondly.
Let's circle back once you've completed the core of the game, and hopefully by then I'll have completed the epilogue, because I'm very curious what you will think of the final 2 chapters of the game.
All right.
Because I think
be continued.
Whoa. Yeah.
All right.
Definitely to be continued. And I'm also curious on the opposite end if the epilogue is if it's more promising. I'm very curious to figure out how they, what does it mean to continue in the world after the story?
Mm-hmm. This is not the last Red Dead Redemption game.
Yeah, I think that's.
But where do they go from here? I think there's only one way to move forward, which is we stop this episode and then go play some more Red Dead.
That sounds great.
Good. All right. Thanks,
okay.
Chris.